Hey.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is a full room this time. Very full. It's about 150 people in here. Sorry about the people who are standing at the back.
On the floor.
Hopefully it's exciting enough to keep you standing for a full hour. I am Damien Edwards.
David Fowler.
This is Mr. Fowler.
Yep.
We're going to talk about some stuff that we've seen. ASP.NET Core has been out for
6 months.
6 months? Is that long? Oh, God, 6 months. Feels like longer because we've been working on it for about 4.5 years.
Yeah.
And we're still not quite finished yet. But we've seen a bunch of stuff now. We've had calls internally from Microsoft support engineers, or the people who help you when you have trouble with your apps, who have seen some things. We've
Stack
seen
Overflow, GitHub.
Stack Overflow, yeah, GitHub issues, Slack, Twitter,
Yep.
and so and our own experience as well. So we wanted to share a bunch of things that we've seen that are either good or some things that aren't so good, and what you should do to avoid those pitfalls. Some of them are pretty bad. Some of them are like, just you could do it a better way. So without further ado, let's get into it. Right into it. First of all, actually, how many people are using ASP.NET Core right now?
In production?
Excellent. What? That's like half the room at least.
That's awesome.
That's fantastic. All right. Very good. Logging. You should always configure a logger. We added this new iLogger abstraction in ASP.NET Core. Well, technically, you can use it anywhere, but it's used throughout ASP.NET Core, and it's not only for you. We use it. So if you want to diagnose stuff, routing or EF, see the queries that are going over the wire, the Kestrel when connections start and stop, as well as requests, all those things we log prodigiously from throughout the framework, and you can configure that stuff so you can see it. And obviously you can log yourself, which you should probably do if you want to be able to diagnose stuff later on in production. So you should always have one set up in production. Now, by default, the application templates that you've used so far do a terrible thing, and they configure a console logger by default, which runs even in production. Now, it does configure it, I think, at the information verbosity level for all loggers,
categories.
Which is probably, that was really intended for you to see it as a developer at the command line, not really intended that you want to capture every information level log forever with your app running in production and route it through the console, which takes a global lock. Doesn't do great things for your performance. And so I would recommend you don't do that, and we actually have changed the templates to only do that in development mode, and then we tweak the settings in production so that we only capture warnings or higher. In production, you should probably use a real logger and plug that into our logging system behind the abstraction, like Serolog, Application Insights, or pick your favorite logging technology.
Elk.
Elk, whatever, Logstash, and whatever you want to use. It's a great first step to use logging to help diagnose problems. So in the past, for example, if you were trying to diagnose route issues, you might use the great route debugger utility. I think Phil Hack
wrote a long
wrote.
time ago.
But now, because we log so much by default, and it's very, very easy to get to see this stuff, it's a really great first step to dial up the logging verbosity from information to debug or even trace if you just want to see everything that gets spat out by our stuff. And then you can, it really shows you the steps going on inside the framework when you're trying to diagnose a problem. You can change the verbosity without having to restart the app. And so the templates are set up by default with a configuration file that you can use, and you can just flip those things on the fly and change the app. We'll have a look at that in a minute. To avoid logging too much, you can also tweak the category. So every log message goes through a specific category. And you can change the verbosity per category, and you can turn it off completely for other categories. And again, by default, we kind of set up the template to capture information for all logs. And then the idea is that you can go in and put specific categories and dial them all the way up and turn other ones all the way down, depending on what it is you're trying to do. And then the other thing is that there are other places that we do log. So ANCM, or the ASP.NET Core module, which is the part of IIS. It's the module we install into IIS that launches .NET .exe and runs your application. That will log to the Windows event log when it fails to launch the process. So if you get the dreaded white screen of death, the IIS screen of death with 503.2 or whatever it is, if the process can't be started, which is a terrible thing to get because it's I have no idea why my app isn't running. It means that it couldn't start the process. And it'll log to the Windows event log and give you a little bit more information as to why. And then you can go in and turn on standard out capturing, which the module allows you to do, and then hopefully you'll get a stack, like an exception in there, and you can actually get a really good idea of why that's there. And it says unhandled exceptions are logged to the configured logger providers by default. That's request exceptions, to be specific. You have some background thread and it throws, and we're not going to know about it. But if a request faults and the exception unwinds all the way back to the host, to Kestrel, or the hosting layer, then we will log that by default to the logger providers. So let's have a quick look at an example of that. I'll create a new app. It might be easier, hey? So I'm going to use 2017 here because, why not? I may as well just use the latest stuff and throw caution to the wind and hope that nothing crashes. Anyone using 2017 RC yet? The CS project tooling? Okay.
Is it good? Yeah. Amazing. I know. It's wonderful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. It's getting better. There'll be a new build
Soon.
very soon, hopefully in the next week or so. Didn't hear that from me.
Tons of fixes.
And has tons and tons and tons of fixes, especially for .NET Core. Okay, so the .NET Core tooling is getting better and better every day. I actually have a private internal build running down here, which I'm not going to show you. Side by side, which is a new feature of Visual Studio 2017, you can run different builds side by side, which is kind of nice. So if I look inside my app settings here, in a file new, you can see I have this logging information. So here the log levels are being configured by this JSON file. And that's passed in my startup CS all the way down here where I configure the logger. So I'm adding the console logger here, and it passes in this logging section. So if I run this application, and I'm going to run it directly rather than through IS Express so I can see the console. I launched the debugger. I probably didn't have to do that, did I?
Oh, no.
I could have just launched it. Anyway, I'm going to it's fine. I can see this thing. Not a problem. So my application is going to start, and I get a browser. So we can see some log information coming through here, and by default we're just logging info. Okay, we're not logging any higher than that. We still get a fair bit of data, which is kind of nice. All the static files are going through here as well, so I'm getting every single request is being logged. But I can choose to come in here and I could dial up this to like debug, and then if I go back and I run the request again, you'll start seeing now we get these debug level messages as well. So we're getting a higher verbosity of messages from the framework. So now Kestrel is telling us about the TCP connection, not just the requests. Okay, so that's a really nice trick to when you start to try and diagnose stuff. You can see here that MVC is reporting that it's looking up the view, and there was a cache hit, so it doesn't have to recompile the view. Okay, so you get really, really deep information about what's going on in the application just by tweaking some of these things that are in the default template. Now, this file-driven config for logging, right now we only support that for the console logger, but we have a bug logged, and we intend to extend that support to more logger providers because, frankly, it'd be really nice to be able to have application insights logging, for example. You'd be able to tweak that on the fly without having to restart the app or any other logger for that example, for that matter too. Okay. So the last thing I want to show you quickly with logging is in the web.config file where you configure ANCM, the ASP.NET Core module that boots .NET XE when you're running in IIS. There's this flag over here, standard log enabled is false. What you can do here is set that to true, and then when I'm running under IIS, if I flip this back to IIS Express, it's going to try and write out a file to this location here. So I'm going to create a logs folder because it won't create the folder for you. Although I think we have a bug to get that fixed, don't we?
No.
We don't? Mm-hmm. Okay. So if you can't figure out why it's not working, the folder has to exist. This actually, totally intuitively, is the prefix for the files that will be created, not a folder. All right, as you'll see in a moment. So if I run this now, and of course I've dialed my logging up to like 400, right? So I'm going to have lots and lots of information going into text files in my app now. So the .NET XE is logging to the console, and then IIS is capturing that information for me and not doing it at all because I don't see a file there. Fowler, what did I do wrong?
Huh?
What did I do wrong?
Did it work?
Don't see it. Do you
Logs.
see it?
It's there.
Oh, it's right there. There it is.
It's
I'm just
working.
not looking.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. And my mouse just slid off the podium, which is why I'm making you fall through all this now. And there it is right there. So, the way,
gotta kill the process
please.
first.
What's that?
Kill the process.
Oh, yeah, because it's locked by the
Yeah.
process. So let me go ahead and stop debugging or come down here and kill IIS Express. Yes. And then now I get, oh, come on.
Psych.
Oh, okay, that is just some other total problem with the build that I'm running. Let's just do the old-fashioned way. So now I can see all those logs as they were funneled through IIS Express. Again, I don't recommend that you do that in production because that's going to slow down your site considerably if you're capturing everything through all the logs through console apps.
We do have a fix, though, to make it not be inline and lock inline. So
we
do have
trying to make that better.
On the
yeah, so we're actually got a fix in process now to make the console logger basically buffer and go from the background thread.
Yeah.
So it doesn't lock. So anyway. All right, configuration and options. We have a whole new config system and this options strongly typed binding system for flowing config throughout your app in ASP.NET Core. We've probably talked about config a lot. We tend not to talk about options too much. I think we should, but we can show you a couple of things here. Configuration supports reloading based on file changes. That's exactly what we just showed you. So that log file, the appsettings.json, those settings were flowing through the config system into the logging system, and then when I change the file, a change propagation takes place, and that goes all the way through into the logging provider and reloads those settings for you. So that's kind of nice. You can use that for your own stuff.
Yeah.
So if you want to change the connection string on the fly while the app is running for whatever reason, you could do that. But any setting that you have in a file-based provider, we support that right out of the box. In 1.1, we added support for reloading options as well. So the typical pattern is that you'll have configuration, which you read from various providers, the environment variables, files on disk, whatever other provider that you write. And then you bind those name-value pairs, because they're just strings at that point, onto rich objects, okay, onto options objects using the options binding system. In 1.0, that was a one-way, one-time thing. And then the options object goes into the DI container.
Resolve once.
And you resolve it once, and you use that throughout your app. In 1.1, we added the iOptions snapshot interface, which allows you to get a snapshot of the current options, but then ask for it to be refreshed at any point in time, which means that if the options themselves were bound from a config provider that supports change notification, you can now get your strongly typed objects that represent your config rebound on the fly while the application is running, which is really, really nice. In cases where you need to configure options objects, and just to remind you, options just aren't for your code. We use the options system to configure our own framework. So when you use MVC and you want to change some features of MVC, you'll often use the MVC options type and you'll change settings on that, okay, in the startup code of your application. If you have a complicated set of logic that you need to set up an object, an options object, you can actually put a service in the container that says, I configure options of this type. And the advantage of that is now you can activate that service if you depend on other services in DI, because it's kind of this reentrant problem, right? So you don't want to have to put a Lambda inline in your configure services code,
I'll get service,
and then like get everything in the constructor, which you can't because the things won't be, the container's not there yet. So there's kind of this lifetime thing you have to worry about. So if you, when you're configuring options, if you need other things from the container, you can simply create a type, implement this interface, put that type in the container, and then anytime, anywhere in your app, someone says, I need this options object, your options configuration type will run. Okay, and that includes getting stuff out of the container. And we'll show you an example of that in a minute. This is just a best practice type of thing. Generally, the advice in terms of environmental configuration, so that's config that's unique to a specific environment, so development, staging, test, prod, etc. You want to keep that configuration as close to the environment or in the environment if possible, so that you don't have configuration for one environment that has to be managed somewhere else and then flowed with your application. And that's one of the primary reasons we designed the config system the way we did, and the whole environment name system in ASP.NET Core. So you can have config that comes from places that traditionally live on the server or in the environment that you're running in. So for example, use environment variables so that they live on the server. So when you set up the server, or if you're running in Azure or an environment like that, you can set it once and then it flows in, or use config stories that your platform provides, so something like Azure Key Vault. Mr. Skeet.
Do you expect services like Key Vault to come with their own config options, at least in the future? I was working with Key Vault just over Christmas time, and it took me several tries to get it right.
Yeah, so Key Vault isn't the easiest system to use today. It's very secure. Very secure.
Which means hard to use.
We shipped a Key Vault config provider
which requires
in 1.1.
To configure.
Which the trouble there is that generally to connect to something as complicated as Key Vault, you need config to control the keys and the connection string and stuff like that. And so, but there is a provider. So as long as you can get the connection string for your Key Vault and this client cert or whatever it requires for you to connect from some other mechanism, so maybe you put it in an environment variable, read it manually, or create a first round of config that reads from the environment, build that config object, and then flow that one into the second one so you can connect to Key Vault. We support that now. We have an inbuilt provider that you can, just in a NuGet package, you can grab. And there is probably an example on in the repo. I imagine,
Yes, there
for
is.
that. There is. I think
There
there's an
is,
example
there is.
in the repo for that.
There is.
And if not, just ping us and we'll give you one. The last thing that you can do is you can actually set environment variables that are local to your application when you're running in IIS via the web.config file, which hasn't always been true in IIS. I think this was added in
IS 10.
10 maybe, but
Windows
we
10?
can do it in the ANCM module.
Module,
So if you're
yeah.
running on .NET Core and you're running on IIS on Windows 2008 R2 or 2012, you can do this because the core module itself supports setting environment variables.
Right.
We've seen lots of customers who
Set
go, I need to
machine
set an
wide
environment
variable,
variable. They set it on the machine that IIS is running on, just so that it flows to the one app. You don't need to do that. You can just do it in the web.config file for that one app. Okay, it's much more isolated. So that's a good way of doing that as well. Oh, I was going to do a demo here, was I? What were we going to do? Oh, yes. So just an example of this iConfigure option stuff that I was talking about. This is my project that runs the live ASP.NET website, that runs the community stand-up every week. And if I look in my startup class here, down in this section, oops, that was the wrong key. Down in this section here, I am adding an iConfigure options here somewhere. I saw it just before.
Right down, right there. 64. Right there.
There. So this line here, this death by generics, line 64. So I'm using a new version of the Application Insights SDK for ASP.NET Core, which is currently in beta, which will RTM soon, which greatly simplifies setting up App Insights with ASP.NET Core, which is nice. And it has an options object that you can use to configure it, which is great, just like a lot of the things. But I needed to set options on that based on the current environment. So if I'm in production, I want to do this. If I'm in development, I want to do that. To get the current environment, I need the iHosting environment interface, which is in the container. So I could capture it kind of up here, put it in a variable, and then use it in here, but it just makes the startup class get a little messy. So I encapsulated all that in this type, which is in my application. Okay, so it implements iConfigure options of application insight service options. I take in this case, it was actually deployment environment, sorry, not iHosting environment. This is my type. And so now I can set this option here and also get stuff from DI. It's very, very simple. So there's generally a way in ASP.NET Core via the DI system to register a service that does a whole bunch of other things and use the DI container to get things that you need. So that's a very, very simple way of doing that. Okay. I'm not going to do the environment variable ones.
What?
Yeah, I'm not going to do that. All right, file upload. You can do this one.
Awesome. Okay, so file upload is pretty scary. Does anyone support a site that actually handles file uploads? No one ever did that? No?
No one has files
No
that get
YouTube-
uploaded to
no
their
YouTube
site.
clones. So in ASP.NET Core, we have a split between content root and web root. Web root is for web files to be served by the web server. The content root is for your source code. And that split is because we want non-IS-based web servers to not serve random files. So in the past, IS had a giant whitelist that said, I can serve these file types, and in the future, what we want to do is say, point IS to the web root folder, so it can only serve files that were JavaScript files for content, and your code files never actually got served by the web browser. So if you want to have your uploaded files served by the web server, you have to put it in the web root.
Right.
All right, so in MVC, there's a way to auto bind an iForm file, which is a new abstraction that we have in ASP.NET Core for getting files. Or you can bind an iForm collection. In the past, I think it was an iForm posted file or something like that. So there's a new
type.
Type for this thing. If you're in middleware and you have to get the form, you call read form async or .form, and that gives you the entire form with files as well.
If you use .form, is that a blocking call?
Right. So yes. So
okay.
.form is bad. You want to use read form async first. .form does a blocking call via read form async, so you kind of want to use the async version if you can. You should use that, yeah, because sync is bad.
Yeah, just to make that really clear.
Yeah.
If you use HTTP-context.form in a piece of middleware, and you haven't had something else that has read
read form
async on your behalf,
and it becomes,
then
synchronous.
you've now blocked a thread while you upload everything from the browser to the server.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't all go into memory, which we'll talk about in a minute, but still, you don't want to do that.
So those two calls actually throw errors if you aren't in a form-based request. You have to check the has form content type before calling read form async, which happens in MVC for you on your behalf. Don't worry about it if you're using MVC. It's interesting. In ASP.NET of the past, you could actually upload CS files to app code or upload view files to the view folder, and those would run on the server. So if you're
Some systems were actually built on that premise.
Orchard and other CMSs kind of let you upload
.NET Nuke.
this kind of content. It's pretty much remote code execution on the server side. So if you don't want to upload this, you kind of want to make sure you aren't allowing uploads of these kind of files on your server. So definitely block that from by default for your server-side stuff. If the file upload is above 64K, I believe, we start buffering to disk on your behalf. So when you call read stream, we actually save the content on disk so you don't bloat memory with giant files. That's good.
Can you change where it gets saved?
You can change where it gets saved by changing ASP.NET Core _ temp path.
Okay.
By default, it goes to like, your temp folder. Okay, this is a pretty good one. So when someone uploads the file name comes from the client side, which you can't trust. The client is untrustworthy. So by default, if you take that path and you path combine and save it to disk, and it has like a path traversal to your C drive, you don't want to save files like on your hard drive.
But of course, your app is running as a low privilege account, so that will never happen.
Don't sudo run your app on the server and like give admin privileges. If you want to do very manual parsing of the body, we have types that give you access to the actual multi-part body, so you can read the actual thing.
It's been 15 years with ASP.NET, and this is the first time we've had anything in the framework that lets you do this.
It's super nice.
It's actually really, really. Has anyone ever tried to process like very large file uploads on ASP.NET? Okay.
Manually?
Manually? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
It's
because
easier
you have
now.
to parse MIME, like multi-part MIME encoding yourself. Whereas now we actually have a thing that does it for you, which is great. Oh,
IS
yeah.
still applies.
And
so,
if you're behind IS.
Yeah. So request filtering still applies, and that isn't fixed for you on your behalf.
Let's break some stuff.
I don't have a Mac, so I have to figure out how to use this computer. All right, so here's a sample. Pretty benign code. A file upload. That's pretty simple, right?
Do you want to zoom slightly?
Oh, yeah. Oh, God.
Just control scroll.
The
it.
control?
Control. Oh, no, don't. Oh,
150.
my goodness. You're such a Mac user. There we
Ugh.
go.
The trackpad on this thing is awful. All right. So upload, the action takes an iForm file, and I'm saying I want to get it from the form. The name of the field is data. Bind an iForm file. Get that file, open the stream, path combine the content root, which is my code root of the site, and pass the file name, and then create that file, copy the input stream into the output stream. Pretty simple, right? All right, let's hack this now. Let's hack my site. So I'm going to launch this in the browser someday. What?
Oh, I may have hacked it already.
Oh, God.
You might need to reset it. Just go and delete that file.
Oh, my God.
Sorry.
You ruined the entire demo.
Go back. It's right there in the root. There
All
you
right. Delete.
go. Preserve the
That
get the
didn't
other
happen.
one back.
That didn't happen.
It was so easy to hack, even I did it.
Is it still there? Oh, this is actually interesting. Store stuff in configuration. All right. Run it again. And we have a file upload. You know I need Fiddler to fiddle with stuff. Let's upload this file. Submit. What the?
Broke it.
I'm going to blame you somehow.
What did you do?
What?
You broke the demo, dude.
Why is it locked?
Is it locked?
Okay, you know what? This is going to work.
Hit refresh.
Let's try again. F5.
Perfect.
Perfect. Wrong site. Okay, so that worked. I have a file in my root. Benign, fine so far, nothing bad. Now in Windows, you can't rename a file to have // but
Or slash of any
or
sort.
slash
really.
or some things. I think even on this, you can't do that.
Right.
So instead, what a good hacker would do is download Fiddler from Telerik and change the request that was. Let me zoom into this. Is it Control Plus? What's the zoom tool?
Window.
Alt or
Window
Window
plus.
All right. Right click. I'm going to edit this upload request. Let's replay it with an edit. And then I'm going to change. Where's the body? Is it
Raw.
raw? All right. Let's change this to. Oh my God.
Yeah, it kind of
This mouse
slides
is
down the
awful.
left.
It's like, okay, let me.
Use the touch pad.
I got it. Let's change this to views. It's all caps. Views.
Home.
Home.
So that looks legit.
Perfect.
Nice.
And let's change the content. Hacked. Wonderful. Let's run this. See what happens on the server side. Okay, let me zoom out. Change here, and now perfect. All right.
Oops.
So if I refresh this page now,
Yeah.
wonderful. Okay, so don't take stuff from the client and ever use it on the server side without clean the names.
Right.
So I think best practice would be if you want to serve these files, you want to store it with like a GUID. Pick a random name that is that file. Map the client file name to your random GUID, and then serve that via like static file middleware or by code or something. But don't use what the client sends you like verbatim. That's kind of like best practice in web scenarios. I think that was the only scenario. Okay, there's one more sample. We have a repository called Entropy, which is I believe it's described as a chaotic playground of experimental ASP.NET. That's not, it's Entropy.
Not how you spell it. There we go.
All right. So here is a sample repository that has a bunch of samples of things that are kind of not edgy, but they're kind of not the mainline scenarios for ASP.NET Core things. So as an example, there's a multi-part file upload sample that shows you how to use the actual low-level APIs to parse the request body. So as an example, we have a middleware that checks the content type for multi-part content, does the random parsing using the multi-part reader API we have in the framework now, calls readNext async, so you can actually read the actual multi-part requests without having to parse it yourself manually.
Nice.
So do explore Entropy because there are a bunch of cool samples in here that are kind of like fringe and no one.
Yeah, there's like dozens and dozens of samples in
there's
that
file
repo.
upload. There's file upload via middleware, which is
And they're all sort of categorized.
upload files.
What's that one do?
So you can see request limits via IS, bump it because by default it's 4 megs, so make it like max int. And then you keep going down here. You can see you call read form async to get the actual form. Then you can enumerate the form and the files in the form. Get
It's
the
multi-file
file name.
upload, right? From modern browsers.
Yep.
Yep.
And a very nice view here, written in
One
Scratch.
that doesn't have Razor.
Yep.
Cool.
All right. This is shift. Perfect. All right, DI. Who here uses our built-in container? Who uses Autofact? So this applies to the built-in container. It may apply to other containers as well. I'm not sure about their details, but take it as general knowledge of how these things work in general. Okay, so by default, keep your DI factories fast and synchronous. We've seen cases where people have async factories, and they have to block because the call site is actually synchronous. So you end up doing an await.result. Don't use .result ever. You have to, but don't use it ever. But don't try it. Like,
Especially don't
avoid
use it in a factory.
Yeah.
In the DI container.
You can cause a deadlock. We had a team in Microsoft send us a stack trace, and they basically killed their entire service by doing a simple asynchronous call in DI.
Yep.
And we'll show a demo of that later today. And it's kind of an implementation quirk of our container, but just don't block.
If you ever find yourself having to call
.result,
or .wait in the task, stop.
This thing's super hard.
Take a 15-minute break, and then come back and look at the code and think really hard about whether you really should be doing that right now.
So how do you keep things fast and synchronous if we talked about key vault before?
Yes.
Suppose you need people to initialize something.
Right.
That's going to make a network.
Don't do it in the constructor.
You can defer it to be like not in the constructor.
Right.
So you can do it later on. So this team actually had a bug with key vault. They were doing .keyvault.get blah.result, and it killed the entire service.
So I mean, the point is just defer the expensive operation until after the object is constructed, and then sort of do it on. So what you ultimately want to do is if you have something asynchronous, you want that to run while you're in the request pipeline. Or do it up front when the application is starting. Like just front load it if you have to, where it's safe to do .result.
Yeah.
And then put the thing in the container and then go from there. But
yeah.
The containers are lazily initialized. So if you register a factory, it's not going to run until someone asks for it. So the total hack is you could keep doing a horrible factory, and then the configure method, you could resolve that service while you still haven't had the service start, and that will work just fine.
Yeah.
Okay? But you have to really understand the life cycle there to make sure you do the right thing. It's very easy to shoot yourself.
If you're crazy, you can add task of T to the actual container.
Yes.
But don't do that. But, I mean, so Autofact supports lazy of T, and you can do kind of cool stuff there.
Yeah.
Avoid calling get service because it's hard to test stuff, and the container that we have does a better job if it can see the entire object graph. So if you have A, B, and C all declared as constructor arguments, it can generate better code than if you called get service from each time from each of those different services. So
This is basically a void
I will show.
service locator.
Yeah.
Like, if you ever heard that pattern,
Avoid it
try not to
completely.
do that.
By default, our container stores all disposable transient services until the container is disposed. So it means if you have a disposable transient service that's resolved from the root container of the application, it will never be disposed until the application goes away. And the issue there is if you end up resolving a bunch of services, it'll be held onto forever. So it's kind of a built-in memory leak.
Yeah.
We may look at tweaking this, but right now it happens. So just don't try to avoid it if you can. We have a new feature in ASP.NET Core 1.1 that is scope validation. So basically, if you have a thing where you have kind of a scope service that captures, if you have a singleton service capturing a scope service, that's probably a bug. We had actually a bug in the framework. It's pretty bad. If you're using MVC 1.0, please update.
Please update to 101.
There's a bug.
Or 102.
There's an issue. So this dependency should have been transient, but instead it was singleton, and it was capturing a per request dependency. So we captured the user once, and then we shared it for all.
So we handily cached the
it's
authentication
kind of good caching
after the first request.
Yeah, it was.
That was only in a certain case. Like you had to. It was only if you used this type, the view component result executor.
Right.
So it would only happen if you had a controller that had an action method that returned a view component result, which was very rare. Like it was a very it's a rarely used feature.
Yeah.
And so we deemed it not a massively bad issue,
Yeah.
but it was bad enough to get fixed in 101.
So update your.
So make sure you update. That's why it's important to update your packages.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so here's kind of the thing we're talking about. If you declare A, B, and C in the constructor arguments, we can generate code like this at runtime, versus you doing service locator pattern where you take in the service and you call get service manually.
That uppercase P is bugging me now.
Which B?
That one there. Can you fix that one? Go to your slide, because it's just making me there. That P there.
Oh my gosh.
Damn you, autocorrect. There we go.
Abomination.
Why did I put code in a PowerPoint slide? Like,
Abomination.
seriously. There we go.
Right, so
It's better.
each call to get service does a dictionary lookup as well, so you're kind of paying the cost of dictionary lookup every time you call get service. So if you can declare your object graphs all in the same call tree, it's kind of a better job we can do on making that fast. All right, let's do a demo now of DI stuff. So same app. First thing, transient without disposable. Let's put a F10, I believe.
Set your startup project.
Is it F10? Oh, it's too late. VS has chosen to stop. Okay, wonderful. Let's do this F10 or F11? I don't even know what it is anymore. All right, that was fast. Whoa. F11. So right here I have a service. This is completely useless for me right now. I have a service collection. And by the way, you can use our container in any project. It's not just an ASP.NET Core only container. You can use it in any project, as I'm proving right here. This is a console application. A new service collection I have F11. I'll add a transient disposable service. If we look here, it's disposable. It says disposes, so it's not a big deal. I add transient. I call build service provider, I get service provider back. Then I resolve it 1,000 times. And if I put a breakpoint here and just skip over it, you'll see we have a list called transient disposables, and it's just stored. So you should avoid doing that because unless your container is scoped, it will never go away until the end of the application. So let me zoom in on this thing if the mouse didn't stop like going away. Control. There you go. Tons of disposables.
Not good.
So to work around it, you really want to use your transient disposables only in the scope container, the per request container, because that gets disposed. If you dispose the service provider, they should all go away after that resolution.
Right.
There you go.
But in an ASP.NET app, that only happens when the app shuts down.
Right.
Right, if you do this in the root.
So avoid that pattern.
I think that presents itself, if you do it accidentally, as a memory leak.
Yeah.
You'll just look at it and go, why do I have so much memory being used by my application? And a quick heap analysis will show you that,
Yep.
oh, I have all these things being rooted.
All right, the fun one. Dead
Oh,
liquid
yeah.
factories.
This is awesome.
All right, so this is kind of a mind bender. So I create a service collection. I'm going to add a singleton. And this is a factory. The factory takes in a service provider, and I'm going to get, so let me show you A and B first. A takes a B, very simple. object graph, right? Now I go into my function, I add singleton for A, and in that factory, what it does is it gets a B asynchronously, does dot result, and creates a new A with a B. I'm going to put a breakpoint here so you can see what happens. And then I call get service A, which calls get B async. And what get B async does, it does something asynchronous. Comes back and then calls get service B. So it's basically just calling get service on B after a thread hop. And there you go.
We can sit and watch that now for a few days because it's not going to go anywhere.
Wait for it to end, but it won't. And if I pause all threads and look at parallel stacks, which is an awesome feature you should always use. Parallel stacks.
You know you're in trouble if you have to use parallel stacks, though. Like, you know you're really into one of those days where it's like, okay.
It's a good day.
It's a good day.
So,
diagnosing deadlocks is awesome.
So you can't really see it, but visit scope takes a lock on the container, and we're currently waiting on the result of that task.result to complete. But since we did a task.delay, which did a thread hop to a different thread, and then we called get service after that thread hop, that get service is waiting for the same lock. So we're in this deadlock situation. And it's super hard to know when this happens, so you should just avoid calling get service after those async calls. It will make things horrible. So the team that did this ended up happening on their service, and it killed the entire website. So what it means is that every request just hangs completely.
Basically, any call to get service now
just hangs.
Right? They're all waiting on the same lock.
Right.
So
scary and fun.
So don't do that.
But if you had some code that maybe calls into code you don't know about
yes.
in your factory that happens to do basic stuff that doesn't call get service.
Right. It's fine.
That works. Yeah. So the funny thing is, if I move this code, if I did this above the delay, it's fine.
Where you'll have problems is that if you take a third-party dependency, they have a nice extension method that hangs off iService collection. You say, yeah, add third-party libraries things, and they register a crap load of factories that do some async stuff. You'll have no idea.
Yeah.
And I was kind of lamenting with David before when we were looking at this. I'm like, wouldn't it be nice if the parallel stacks window or something in VS showed you when locks were being acquired and not? Because while we can look at those two threads in their stacks, and we know that those two frames there, we know they both share the same lock. You have no idea. That's our code. But that information is all tracked by the CLR. You can see all that stuff if you have the right tools. So I'm going to log a bug.
Yeah, we will look at fixing it. I mean, so we do have a thing to look at taking more granular locks instead of locking the entire container. But the thought was, if you have the constructor, it should be fast, right? You can't do anything constructor. But having factories kind of makes it go away because you can do anything in here with code. All right. Captive dependency. This is a term coined by Mark Seaman, who's actually here, I think, talking and doing other stuff. His blog post is here about this whole pattern. So I have
anti-pattern.
Anti-pattern. I have A and B services. A is singleton, B is scoped. Remember the thing? A takes a B. So I have a singleton thing capturing a scope thing. And the problem is it'll create A once, and it will capture whatever B happens to be in that scope at that point in time. So let's debug this and see what it does. So I made a resolved magic. So now I have, A doesn't hold on to B in my code, but A now has captured B forever. That's bad in some cases. So in 1.1, we have this new feature that says, please check my...
Hold my hand for me,
please. Check my work.
Yep.
Make sure I got an A. And what it does is it checks for these common patterns that end up being mistakes. And it says, oh my God, you can't consume a singleton you can't consume a scope from a singleton. What are you doing? So I recommend turning this on, just to see if you configure your bindings properly in the container by default. We haven't turned it on by default because we were scared of making breaking changes.
Yeah. We could do it in 2.0.
In 2.0, it'll be on by default.
We might turn it on by default.
Yeah.
We can see before you call get required service that you've got a scope thing.
Yes.
And a singleton that depends on it.
Yes.
Is there any reason why it doesn't go bang when you call build service?
Good question.
Yeah, so we didn't want to walk the entire object graph of the container at the time you call build, because that's a perf hit. If you're walking, because this thing is super lazy, so it kind of walks the graph at the point in time you call get service, and we didn't want to change the design to make it have to walk the entire thing. It would be better because doing this, you only catch it if you happen to call get service, which is unfortunate, but
I mean, we could certainly add a method
yeah,
on
that
the
kind of
resolve type
force
that you could
swaps the
down
entire
past iService provider to our
you call
type,
verify.
you call verify,
Yeah.
and then it would force evaluation. We could do that.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you could do that. So you would know immediately rather than, because you're right, because it's lazy, you basically have to run through the entire app before you see it.
Yeah.
So that's a good,
It's a little bit unfortunate.
that's a good thing. We should do that.
All right. The last one is also another category of issue where
DI just sounds scary, basically.
DI is awesome. Really scary.
I mean, it's awesome, but it's like, there are just subtle things that you can...
So scope service is a singleton within that container. What that means is that if you have a new container, a scope service will live for as long as that container lives. So you have one instance for that container. When you're per request, the scope is a request scope, so you have a singleton within the request. So if you resolve a scope service from the app container, you have a singleton.
Right.
So that's mostly a mistake, right? If you have a scope service like B, and you didn't create a scope container, and you called resolve from the top-level container, you're kind of capturing the scope service as a singleton forever, if that makes sense. So in this example, I added a scope service B, and I built it with the validate scopes true. And I created a child scope container to resolve that dependency from, and this is fine. I made a child service provider, I resolved B, it went away, all good. But now if I resolve B from the app-level container, which is not in the scope, it throws and says, you can't resolve a scope service from the root provider. And that's kind of another issue that we see in applications. So
now, I mean, it might be a little hard to see because we've boiled these demos down to their simplest possible thing. In ASP.NET, in an app, you'll have a bunch of service registrations.
1,000 services.
You
like,
configure services. And the way you would run into this typically is in your configure method, you will take in one of those scope services in like the next line underneath. So you'll set up a bunch of stuff, something might be scoped, then in your configure method, you want to take in that service because you need it while you're building the HTTP pipeline.
Right.
And that's when you'd get into this situation. Okay?
One
it's
example
kind of hard
is,
to get something from the app container otherwise.
if you add a DB context and you get it in your configure method, that will be a singleton.
Right.
And it will never get disclosed.
Which is
kinda-
often done for seeding, for example.
So you end up leaking the connection because you have a context open for the entire application lifetime.
Right.
So you kind of want to create a scope. If you're doing manual resolution of services, you want to call create scope for scope services so it goes away at the end of the scope. Is that a question? Yeah. It does it every time.
Yeah, it does every time.
Yeah, we could cache it, I guess, and make it.
I mean, you could.
We could cache it, yeah. But today it does every time you call resolve. The container is actually pretty clever. There's two code paths. The way it works is when you have an object graph built up and you call get service, the first time it uses reflection, and then the second time it says, okay, this is being resolved more than once. So it queues a work item to the thread pool that compiles an entire object graph into IL, and then it says, okay, I'm going to replace the reflection-based one with the IL-based one, and that happens like on the fly. So you get really fast performance once you call get service more than once. It's kind of an interpret then JIT style pattern.
What's the pattern then for seeding a scope?
So you just need to create the scope. So like if you want to do that in the configure, you would get IAP services, IAP builder, application services. You would create the scope off that, then resolve what you want there, rather than just injecting in the DB context directly into configure and do it that way. Or create I mean, you could try and create a service that does it for you, but that's a little wonky. You'd be trying to create a scope within your service, which is a little weird, but it's possible.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's all for DI.
Or you seed lazily.
Yep.
Yes. So, yes.
It's not, so nothing is implicit. So, okay, so this is actually important. So
the question was, is there always a scope per request?
There is. There's also scope for request. I think the big thing
we turn it on by default.
Yeah, the big thing is if you have to resolve services from that scope. So if you don't call get service on that specific container, you're going to get it from the application scope. So for example, if I wanted to get a scope service, I would call HTTP context.request services.
Right.
Like this is a specific scope we create that we give that we hand to you to call resolve from. The way it works mostly is that we create stuff from request scope. So once you're in a request scope, like for a controller, if you get more things here that are scoped, you'll be in a scope already. So we resolve things from request services on your behalf, so you don't have to call this yourself, and it should be in the right scope.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is You don't have to worry about this if you don't use service locator. If you don't use the service locator pattern, you generally never have to worry about this because you're using constructor injection, and whoever is building that type, like MVC, is doing all this for you. It's only when you take the iService provider yourself and then you're saying, I'm going to take control of everything, or you grab the HTTP context and you start digging around in there to find the right container, is when you'll run into these issues.
Yep.
Okay.
Good. Is that
MVC. I'll do this one.
yeah.
All right, so who's heard of mass assignment or overbinding? Okay, 1 hand, 2 hands, 3 hands. I hope more people will go and look it up after this, 4 hands, because it's scary.
Who uses their EF models in their model binding for input?
Who accepts their EF models in their action result?
And Hibernate?
Or their ORM model? No one. Who uses
ORM?
view models instead, or input one? Okay.
You guys are good.
Who shares the same view model for the post and the get?
Don't be ashamed.
Don't be ashamed. This is fine. That's usually the progression,
judgment,
right?
no
Usually
judgment.
the progression is you start out, you watch a demo from 4 years ago that Scott Hanselman did, or me, or you, and you say, oh, look, it's so easy. You scaffold out, you create a class, it scaffolds out the database, it scaffolds out the front end, go home, right? It's fine. And you go, okay, well, this isn't good. So then you create a view model, and then you use a single view model for both the sort of reading part of the form, or the API, and the writing part of the form. And then over time, you realize, well, maybe I should really have a separate model for handling the input, and then one for the output. And that's kind of the ultimate realization of this. The problem with having a single model that represents multiple operations, obviously, is when you're doing incoming binding, when model binding is looking at stuff in the request and saying, I need to build a customer object because that's in your action method, then it's just going to take data from the input and try and match it up with property names and bind that on there. And if you don't explicitly call out what you want binded and what you don't, I can just bind stuff to any writable property on that customer, which you may not have intended. You may only be displaying 3 fields for editing, but it might have 20 fields, and now I can overbind or mass assign those values, and then you'll just screw all that away in the database, and now I've done something you didn't intend.
GitHub was hacked, by the way, via this mechanism a while back. So
very publicly, about 2012, I think.
Yeah.
So there's a way to, the way to protect against that is to use separate input-output models. So, or you can use, there's a notation that we have using attributes to say, bind to this thing, but then you can pass strings to say which properties you want to bind, or you can decorate the properties that you don't want bound with never bind. So there are ways to do it, but I hate all those ways because they're horrible. This is a much nicer, purer way of doing it. Just have separate types.
More classes.
More classes, right? That's a C#. You shouldn't be afraid of creating classes.
Add more classes.
Some tag helpers. Handling, who's written a custom tag helper? Anybody? Good. Okay, so I'm not just talking to a bunch of people who have never written a tag helper, which is good. But if you do, because you will, because they're great, you'll find yourself going, I really wish I could just do this once throughout my app, and this is a really good way to do it. You need to handle attribute values. If you're reading values from an attribute on the HTML element, one that isn't bound to a property on the tag helper itself, then there's a special way to handle those values. Because with Razor, it could be a literal string, or it could be the result of C#, right? You could have at blah, 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 blah as the HTML property, and then that flows through to your tag helper, not just as a string, but as a thing that hasn't been evaluated yet. It's like a special type, and you have to handle that correctly. If you're writing tag helpers where you look at an HTML attribute and you assume that that's a path, so for example, if you write a tag helper that augments the script tag, and you look at the source attribute, it points to a path, and you want to go and load the file and do stuff, you have to protect against whatever that thing is pointing to. I've seen a lot of people write tag helpers, and they don't properly validate that the thing that's being passed into the path is actually in the site. Okay, it's a similar problem to the path traversal issue, but of course, a lot of the time, those attributes will point to other websites, completely, like a full HTTP address, so you have to handle those things correctly. Another one is using temp data for post-redirect get operation state. So post-redirect get, for those who don't know, is the operation where you say, okay, I've got a form, I post that to a controller, I do my processing. If everything is valid, then rather than just returning from the post, which means I'm showing the user an HTML result as a result of a post, which means if they hit F5, they'll get that horrible dialog in the browser that says resend the request. What you want to do, if the post was successful, is you want to redirect, as a send a redirect response that goes back to maybe the original page or a success page or something to force the browser to do a get. So it's a nice, clean state. The problem is you generally want to give like some type of success message. You want to pass information through that post redirect get cycle. Maybe, congratulations, you created your order or something like that. Some people use cookies to do that, like a temporary cookie that goes in and then comes out and they clean it out. Maybe they'll use the query string to pass data. Using query strings a little, because now you can taking data from the query string. If you're not using it properly, you can open yourself up to issues. Or you might use session, okay, to do that stuff, or a user profile. Temp data in MVC is a really nice, succinct, crisp way of doing that. That just manages the whole problem of a user makes one request, I want some data that round trips for exactly one more request. That's what temp data does. Okay, so using that for post redirect get state is kind of nice. So I'm going to show you examples of these in the live ASP.NET website. So let's look at mass assignment protection. So in my admin controller, so I'll look at my home controller first, actually. My home controller here, this is a real site, so there's a lot more code. Okay, so let's have a look at what I'm returning. So the index, which is the home page, isn't taking in anything, it's just a get, but it returns a home view model. So I have a specific view model type that is for displaying information on the home page. Okay? It's just for doing that. It's nothing to do with taking stuff in. If I go to the admin controller and I look at the post that you can perform to actually update that stuff, you can see I've actually declared a class in line in my controller called the admin input model. And then I take that in my save method. Okay? So the contract of what I want to be able to be posted into this action method is right next to it, which I kind of like. I mean, yes, I could put the class in a different place, but I kind of like having it as a nested class of this controller. And then in terms of validation, I can tell MVC to get its model metadata from a different model. This is the buddy type system. So rather than having to duplicate validation attributes, I can say, well, the admin input model just gets all of its validation from sort of this master admin view model, okay? Because I want to have validation on the way out so that when you render the admin screen, validation works. Client-side validation works. It needs to send all the validation information down. But then on the way in, I need validation to be there as well so I can run it when I check model state, obviously. So if I'm using two models, I don't want to have to duplicate that. I only want it on one, and this is one way of doing that. You can also use inheritance, so you can have sort of the base model, which has the validation, and have a derived model, and you only add the extra properties that you need for that one. But I just find this one a little cleaner this way.
If you've got a really simple one,
yes?
would any of this work with C#7 value tuples?
So the question was, would any of this
no.
work with C#7 value tuples?
Probably not.
I don't think
Not
so.
yet.
Not yet. That's a nice
Soon.
idea, though.
Yeah.
We would look
That'd
at
be
that.
kind of nice, actually.
Okay, so that's using a separate model for input versus viewing. And you can see, like, I'm taking in admin input model here, but if there is an error, I return the admin view model. Okay, so in this case, model state is not valid, so I am returning from the post so the user can see validation errors. I create the view model, I populate that from the input model and the actual live record. So there's basically 3 bits of data, right? The record as it exists right now, what the user posted, and then what I want to send back to the user. I merge all those things together, and then I send that through to the view. All right? Who's used something like AutoMapper before? Okay, great. This is a great case for AutoMapper. I am not using it in this application. I'm doing all the monkey left-hand, right-hand code, as you can see down here. I don't know why. But you should use something like AutoMapper to make this stuff simpler to do. Okay. Looking at tag helpers, I have a couple of custom tag helpers down here. I have a script inlining tag helper, which you can probably guess what that does. If you have an attribute on your script tag that says inline, and rather than rendering a normal script tag that makes a request back to the server, it just inlines the script in the HTML. Really nice for smaller files so you can avoid another request to the server. So I have to handle dealing with the source attribute, okay, as it is in the source HTML. Now, a script tag can point to a JavaScript file anywhere. It can point to a JavaScript file on my site. It could be on a CDN. It could be a random other site. So I need to make sure I'm dealing with that properly. This is the code that you need to write to correctly handle getting the value from a raw attribute. Okay? If I was to declare source as a property on here, which I can do, so I can do this. Okay? That will take care of that for me. All right? The tag helper system will bind the source attribute to my source property, and it will do all this logic for me. But I have an aversion to doing that, because if you do that, then it shows up in the editor as purple, because it now says, oh, this property is from the tag helper, and it overrides the fact that it's HTML, and that just annoys me. So I do it manually. And if you're writing complex tag helpers, you need to do this anyway. So just to walk through this, what it's doing is it says, get the value of the tag helper, this tag helper attribute. It comes back as, you can see here if I zoom in, this mouse podium situation is interesting.
That's
So
good.
it's a tag helper attribute. So when you say, please get me the source attribute from the rendered output that I'm going to render, you get that as type tag helper attribute. I cast that to a string. If it's null, then I go, okay, well, that's not a string. I need to do something else. Let's try and get it as an HTML string. I do that first because it's very cheap to get a real string from an HTML string. I can just grab its value property. So if it's an HTML string, I do that. If it's still not there, then my sort of second last-ditch effort is to get it as an iHTML content. iHTML content is a new type in Razor that effectively represents Razor code, or anything really, that hasn't executed yet. It's something that wants to write out HTML. But in the old Razor, what would happen is we would just do that when we encountered it, and then things would get double, triple, quadruple buffered as they went through all the layers of Razor. And so it would take a lot of strings, basically, to build HTML. Now we have this nice deferred execution system so that we can avoid all this extra buffering. So if it's an iHTML content, you have to do it's a little bit trickier because iHTML content wants to be written to something. You can't just get it as a string. So I have to create a string writer, write it out to it with no encoding. Otherwise, it'll try and encode it with HTML encoding, which I don't want in this case because it's not going to get written out. Then I can toString that. And if all that is false, then I just, screw it. I'll just get toString. I'm assuming it's some other object, and I can just toString it, and I'll get it.
It'd be a great place to use Switch with C#.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm expecting lots of pull requests from John Skeet later on after this talk.
That was way too hard.
I think we should create a helper for this, personally, because that saddened me when I had to write that code.
Yeah.
So the other thing here is dealing with the path. So here's all the logic I'm doing to make sure that once I actually have the source, I'm validating that it actually maps to a file in this site. Okay? And I have to deal with things like path base, where the site may be being hosted under a vdir in IIS. So rather than being rooted at the root of the site, it's like rooted at /foo. I have to account for that. And so I have to grab the path base, do a whole bunch of file exist checking to actually realize that the file is there or it isn't. And once I've done all that work, it's pretty straightforward. It's just going through the sort of the methodology, the method to go through and go, okay, is it a very simple URI? Is it a full URI? Well, yes, and I can't obviously get that file. Is it something on disk? Oh, in my site? Yes. Oh, do I have to adjust for path base? Yes, I do. Go through all that. If it's not there, fail, or just return and do nothing. If it is there, go ahead and read it and then append it to the output. Okay. Lastly, using temp data for post redirect get. So if I go back to my admin controller, it's pretty straightforward. So down here, you can see here in my save method, after a successful save, I want to just show that it's succeeded. So I say, okay, shove into temp data, use the name of this, the success message property on my admin view model as the key, and just say, this is what I want. And then when the get happens, which I come back up here, I pull it back out again, here, and I just cast it, and I just push it straight into there. Simple as that. We are looking at a feature in the next version of MVC that allows you to do something like this. So you'll be able to do string, success message, and then you would just be able to do something like this. And then you would just be able to assign directly to a property on your controller, and then we would take care of screwing it away in temp data and then repopulating it for you on the next request. Okay? We've actually already got a prototype of that as part of our Razor pages work, and that's actually going to be a really nice way of doing that, I think. And that'll be implemented using a filter, so you could actually use it anywhere in MVC, which is kind of cool. Okay. Yes. Yeah, so temp data is totally pluggable. In 1.0, we supported session only. In 1.1, we added a cookie-based temp data provider, which is what I'm using, so I don't need any extra setup. It just encrypts it on the server, signs it, sends it down as a cookie, it gets posted back up again, read, and then cleared. It's very, very nice.
Awesome.
All right, testing your
There's
pipeline.
no
We've got
time.
a minute and a half, so choose what
so
you want to show.
Everything. So we have a feature called Test Host, which is basically a full in-memory web server, so you can test the entire pipeline without booting up a web server, having that work.
Good for integration
This
testing,
is
right?
just nice and interesting. So yeah, let's just show it.
Let's show it.
Let's just show it.
It's not a lot of code, right?
No.
So it's pretty easy to show.
So here's an XUnit test, and what it has is a simple fact that has verify response. And I boot up a web host builder, which is in my program main. If you've seen a program main before, it has this code. New builder, here's the server, here's the content root, here's IIS, all that stuff. Same idea, but less things. So same builder, same startup class. I'm pointing to actually this class right here, which runs response, which writes hello world to the response. And all I'm going to do is boot up the server, the test server, pass in the builder, call create client, and you get it. It should be client back, which is super nice. And you call get async with a, this isn't even important. So
This is actually a really good demonstration of why there's a separation between the web host building sort of phase and the startup class.
Startup, yeah.
So you can do everything in Webhost yourself. Like you can just tag everything on. But this separation allows you to say, well, my app actually starts at startup, and then I can take that app and run it on a different host very simply by doing this. So.
Right, so you just do a get from HTTP client with a random URL because it's not relevant anymore. And you get a response back, read a string, and hello world. So this should just run and work, actually. Let's run a test. Run already. Run a test,
and so to be clear, that's all in memory. There's no socket listening or anything. It literally just runs.
There's no server. It's all in memory connections. And there's even a WebSocket in memory client that we wrote. It's kind of nice. So you can test your entire end-to-end without ever going online.
Cool.
That's awesome. Here's an example of making an environment test-specific. So in your application, I can say, I want to run test-specific code. And I can write code that says, if I'm in environment test, do something like this versus my prod service. And all the service does is it has a string test reproduction based on what host you're running in. So the test just says, I'm going to response.write the service.getData. So I added a service here, got it in the config method, and called getData to respond. Yep, question?
Yep.
Oh. HTTPS. See me after. See me after class. So yeah, if environment is test, it just prints out. It adds the test service. If it's not, it adds the prod service. That's kind of the whole thing.
Cool.
So here we
We're
go.
out of time.
Yep, it's done.
Sweet.
And yeah,
Go back to the slide.
there you go.
All right.
We had more data.
Then we had one more thing. So it's just a bunch about per request state. There's a bunch of different ways that you can store stuff per request. Obviously, you can shove it in the old HTTP context or item, which has been there forever. There's a new thing called features. This is how we flow stateful, not just stateful, but things that have actions,
methods.
things that do stuff on the request throughout the request lifetime. Middleware can add these and read these. You can add your own features to do complicated things, but that's basically how you add capabilities. Scope services, we talked a lot about, things that live for the life of the request generally. And then if you really need to get access to the HTTP context from inside a service, for example, there is a thing called the HTTP context accessor that lives inside the container that you can resolve, and as long as your thing is resolved correctly, and so it just works, it figures itself out, you will get the HTTP context inside your random service, which is kind of nice. That's the replacement for HTTP context.current.
Current.
All right, DI-friendly way of doing it. And that's it. So thank you very much. All the code that we showed you is in a repo up on Fowler's GitHub. So if you want to see that code, go up there.